My presentation is We. We is basically a kind of shorthand for a philosophical approach that I think is essentially Chinese and ancient, but actually, in my opinion, relevant and actually really vital to global culture in the 21st century. And it's basically a philosophy which says that we as individuals are defined by our relationships and that we are made up of and comprised of the people and the ways of life that surround us. And these things enlarge us and make us fuller as human beings. And I think within that sort of observation, there's a latent demand that if we're going to have fuller and more productive lives, we'll have to make an explicit effort to understand and empathize with the people around us and to open ourselves up to them and to also receive input from them. And I think that, given the theme of this TED event, Insider Outsider, that's a relevant approach because I've noticed as an outsider who frequently finds himself inside China that there's a pretty radical disconnect between the way that people perceive China on the outside and the way that China actually operates once you're inside. And I think that that's largely for two reasons. I think that there's basically two narratives that define the outsider impression of China. And the first one is basically the narrative which comes from China itself, which is a kind of bad compilation of the greatest hits of a 5,000-year civilization. And the set tends to be highly skeptical and focused on the inadequacies of China's current state. And a few years ago, I felt that both of these storylines were too weak and undernourishing to really satisfy and accurately capture a situation where a culture is obviously changing very radically and having an enormous influence on the rest of the world. So I thought that in order to understand China better and to be a better, more responsible global citizen, I should go and see what's happening in China and try to, in some modest way, participate in what's happening here and kind of educate myself by collaborating. So I basically did that. I did a series of projects, mostly in 2007 and 2008. So I want to show those projects because in their own way, they all try to embody this idea of reciprocity and of focusing on your connection to the people around you and in encouraging curiosity and sort of fertile cross-pollination. So the first project I'll talk about is Unit. Unit is a magazine that I made together with a European artist named Charlie Kohlhaas. The concept of China is interweaving into the global community and the way that the global community is being interwoven into the fabric of Chinese society. So every issue was about a different country and the way that it related to China. So this is the cover from one of our issues, which was about the Netherlands. And what we tried to do is, through a series of different techniques, emphasize juxtaposition and connection and overlap. This is a very obvious one where we just took panoramic photos taken by a Dutch photographer named Iwan Ban, which show a Dutch landscape and a Chinese landscape and just sort of put them together. We also tried to embrace ignorance, basically, as a starting point to a relationship. So this was a text written by a young Chinese woman who had never been to the Netherlands, but had somehow grafted an opinion of what the Netherlands is based on sort of random input, like things she'd seen on TV or a drunken conversation with a backpacker. And through these sort of different inputs had created her own sense of what Holland was, which was the sort of base point for her relationship with the society. This is a similar one. This is the work of a Dutch photographer who came to China with very limited prior knowledge and then basically photographed everything that she saw. She took tens of thousands of photographs here, all over China, and then made these extremely rigorous inventories of them as a sort of encyclopedia of Chinese daily life, which she then used as her sort of entry point into China contemporary. This is a slightly more in-depth piece, which is about the company United Nude, which is a fashion brand which is founded by a Dutch designer called Remdi Kohlhaas. But it's based in Guangzhou, and it's really a kind of beautiful hybrid of Dutch imagination and Chinese resourcefulness and manufacturing prowess. And in this feature, basically, Rem, the founder, and his company manager, Derry Tang, who's a local woman from Guangzhou, talked about the process of them creating a company together and how they learn to sort of understand their strengths and make the most of them to have a company which is like the best of Dutch and the best of Chinese professional qualities. We did issues on other countries. This is from the US one, this is from the African one. This is from the UK one. The only thing I'll say about this is that what we tried to do is not only talk about what's happening to China, but also the way that China is spreading itself around the world. So these are photos of Chinese restaurants in extremely tiny provincial villages in England. It's just a kind of indication of the incredible reach of Chinese culture, that even in a very backward or a very small place, you find, even in a very seemingly uncosmopolitan place, you find a Chinese restaurant, which I think is a sort of tribute to the Chinese diaspora. One thing about UNIT is that because it's very difficult to get a license to produce a magazine here, what we did is we made a kind of parasite magazine, which was distributed with existing magazines, and then that was its own kind of communication and relationship. So by basically being a sort of invader in this kind of generic brown envelope, inside of an existing magazine, we added an additional voice, which applied some pressure to the host magazine. And we also tried to think of as many different ways as we could spread the information as we could. This was a display that we put in malls in different parts of China to kind of enlarge the audience. All right, the next project I want to talk about is Mad Dinner. Mad Dinner is a book that I made together with MAD, which is an architecture office based here in Beijing. MAD is best known for this building. This was the first architectural competition ever, international architectural competition ever won by a mainland Chinese firm. And this turned them overnight into celebrities here in China and people of note in the international architectural scene. So they wanted to make a book which talked about this experience. They wanted to make a book which really placed their work. And the most important thing about this book, and the thing that I really admire about them, is that they really wanted to incorporate external voices into their book. And they wanted their book to be, they wanted their work to just be one part of a much larger discussion about what's happening in China and what's happening in the world in general. So basically, we came up with the concept of a dinner. And what we did is organize a huge number of contributions, mostly through interviews, with people from all over the world and from different parts of society. And then we sort of presented the metaphor that they were all at an enormous dinner table, which, you know, the dinner table being a sort of preeminent Chinese social space. And basically what that allowed us to do is create interesting juxtapositions among people who would ordinarily never be together at a dinner. So this is, for example, a kind of elite European curator next to a Chinese construction worker. And then what we did is ask very basic questions to them. And then we collected all the answers and we edited them in a way so that they simulated a conversation, so that basically MAD, the authors of the book, could investigate the issues that they were fascinated by and collect these responses. We also had more in-depth conversations, but again, in the way that we handled these, we tried to emphasize relationships, and we tried to put things in a juxtaposed way, which allows them to become more than what they are on their own. So in this case, this is an interview with a Beijing city official, and then its complement or its partner is an interview with a European intellectual who's highly critical of Chinese officials. So we basically put them next to each other. We would have loved to have had them in the same space talking to each other, but we couldn't do that. But we could do that within the space of a book. So we put them together so that the two would interact with one another, and in a way you would get a sort of third dimension to them. We even did an interview with Mies van der Rohe, which is very impressive because he's been dead for 40 years. But essentially what that was an interview with no answers. So it's just questions, and we just wanted to kind of imply that it's worth asking questions even if you can't get an answer for them. And as I said, Mad Dinner was purely a concept. It was a sort of organizational device for this book, but actually in the end, it produced a series of real dinners. This was one in New York, where basically people got together around a big table and discussed the issues which motivated the book. There was one in New York, there were several here in Beijing. Okay, the third project I want to talk about is Urban China. Urban China is a magazine which has been around for 5 years and basically explores a huge variety of cultural and urbanistic phenomena here in China. They have many issues with incredible sort of incredible beauty and incredible curiosity. And unfortunately, our book is only sampling 5. And the most significant thing to say about this book is that it's in English, so it's kept. It's just the language was changed. But there's one thing that's important to emphasize in terms of this theme of me, we that I'm talking about. Basically, we came up with a device where certain phrases or certain aspects of articles were highlighted, which then you could talk about or add to in the margins. So in this case, the 3 years of natural disasters, that's of course a kind of Orwellian government phrase. And so on the one hand, we used it to just sort of provide an orthodox definition of it for people who weren't familiar with that. But on the other hand, in this text which is below it, we sampled from other texts in different parts of the book. And in this case, it's a personal narrative of a woman who describes her experience during the 3 years of natural disasters. So you get a kind of a more personal dimension to it. Different parts of the book. And in this case, it's a personal narrative of a woman who describes her experience during the 3 years of natural disasters. So you get a kind of a more personal dimension to it. Also, the interesting thing about doing this is it provides a kind of alternative narrative through the book so that you don't have to read a book backwards or front to back. You can read it in a lot of different ways depending on how your curiosity is stimulated. So this is a sort of reference to, as you can see, the difficulties of seeing a doctor. And that connects to an article or a photo essay about a tribe in a very remote part of China and the incredible difficulties that they have to secure medical care for. And that connects to an article or a photo essay about a tribe in a very remote part of China and the incredible difficulties that they have to secure medical care for themselves. One additional thing, for instance, this is a story about factory life in Shenzhen. And it makes reference to, for instance, the fact that most of the people in the factory are very young, in their 20s and 30s, most of the workers. And if you follow this link, see this page 42, you get a story about a village which is essentially empty now because all of the working age people have left. So everyone has left the countryside to work in the city. And it's essentially just old people and babies. And I think this is a really critical dimension of China's urbanization, which isn't talked about that much. The fact that everyone's going to the cities, but what happens to the people that are left behind? The final project I'll talk about very quickly is called Who is Architecture? This is a series of interviews that I've been doing with the Chinese edition of Domus magazine, which is an architecture magazine. It's a book. The concept of who is architecture is relevant to what I've been saying because basically what I tried to do is, rather than interviewing architects themselves, I interviewed all the people or many of the people on whom architects rely. So their collaborators and the people who communicate their work to the outside world. So engineers or contractors, curators, photographers. And I tried to, in a way, create an image of a profession in relief so that you leave the central part empty and then you fill in the area around it in detail and then you can see sort of how a profession works without actually talking to any of the people working in it. So here's a few. Liu Zhenggang is the president of Crystal CG, which is the rendering powerhouse, which basically defines the look of modern China. Rory McGowan is an engineer. He's the lead engineer behind CCTV headquarters here in Beijing. Barry Bergdahl is the head of the architectural department of MoMA in New York. Tan Xiaochun is the head of construction for the Bird's Nest. So basically, I just tried to, by interviewing a lot of people, create a sense of that an architect is not a person, not an individual by him or herself, but is actually a composite of a lot of different professions and a lot of different abilities. So basically, really all I want to say in this talk is that I think that in a lot of ways, we're at a moment of enormous potential and enormous risk in that we are more interconnected than ever, but there's a real stubborn sort of ignorance about the way that we interact with one another. And I think that a way to get around that is to just simply embrace curiosity, embrace communication. And I think that it's, especially for Westerners, that really requires a kind of cognitive shift. Because for so long, the kind of culture of introspection has dominated Western literature and psychology. And that it's always encouraging you to think, who am I? What's my identity? What am I about? But actually, I think a much more relevant question for the 21st century is, who are you? And I think that's how we can sort of understand ourselves better, by really actively engaging the people around us and realizing that we're all just part of relationships, and that's what makes us people. Thanks.